try not to keep you here, too late. Um, I'm going to go into sharing, and we're going to do that share application screen thing. And here we go. I'm going to allow you to observe my screen and see what weird videos. Okay. Okay. So there are a number of really good there was no volume. Okay, so that's
It's just a
frustrating.
little bit choppy.
It was just what?
Choppy. You could hear it, but very faintly.
Interesting. That'll be something I'm gonna have to do a dry run, and the next video I think is gonna be from within PowerPoint, and we'll see how that one works. And the last thing I'll just mention, I mean, dolphins. There are many examples of cultural variation in dolphins, including things like tool use of sponges to help with digging, or maybe just as an ornament, as well as vocal differences. So there's a lot you can do on cultural variation and evolution in dolphins. Unfortunately, they're a really hard system to work with, right? So a lot of research is pretty purely descriptive. Okay, I'm sorry. Now I can see. The problem is when I share a screen, I don't see the comments, and no one could hear the video. So that saddens me. One thing I will do is start a Dropbox for this course where I can put videos. If I don't write things down, it's just not going to happen, sadly. But this is on the list after posting an office hour Zoom, right? Because there you go. All the list of things I could have done already. So one conceptual framework that helps us think about behaviors and that got biologists studying behavior into often fruitless arguments are questions that address different levels of analysis. And this is often thought of as ultimate causes versus proximate causes of behavior. So ultimate causes are the adaptive function of a trait, and I'm sorry, I've lost my cursor here. That's why I'm somewhat fumbling around. I just want to see. Great. Okay, so ultimate causes relate to the adaptive function, and they're often considered sort of why questions. Whereas proximate causes focus on um, the mechanisms underlying behaviors. So, and the truth is, you can actually ask these ultimate and proximate questions about much more than behavior. And it's sort of a useful framework. But proximate causes are going to be things like, how does a behavior develop? So that would include things like genetic effects. Whoa! Learning and other environmental effects. And then things on even shorter time scales, it can be um, things like neural or endocrine pathways that lead to a behavior. So how do hormone levels change, song behavior? Neural or pathways. And so proximate causes, the cartoon version is that they're answering, proximate questions are sort of how questions. And the main thing in terms of not screwing up your levels of analysis is that it doesn't actually tell you like, to say like, why do birds sing in the morning more than in the evening? And and if the answer is, well, um, birds respond to light with a flush of hormones that leads to song, or the hippocampus directs them to sing in the morning and it doesn't at night. Those are proximate sort of explanations, but they don't actually answer the why question of why birds are singing in the morning versus at night. The best guess, by the way, is because there's uncertainty in how much um, energy you need for shivering to survive cold nights. And then whenever it's not that cold, you often wake up with a surplus of energy and you can sing. And that's probably the ultimate reason why there's a dawn chorus in birds. But anyway, and there's more singing after a milder night than after a colder night. Nico Tinbergen sort of divided up these ultimate and proximate questions into what are called Tinbergen's 4 questions. So if you're going into animal behavior grad school, this is like the stuff of first year exams. What are Tinbergen's 4? It's a great short paper to read. But he talked about his 4 questions included the evolutionary history and phylogenetic constraints, or the adaptive function, which are both ultimate ultimate questions. Note that this is I've put Tinbergen's 4 questions on a scale going vertically from longest to shortest time frame. And more specifically than that, okay, let's, that saddens me. More specifically than that, um, these ultimate explanations all take place on a time frame longer than a lifetime. Why do I say that? So for traits to have an adaptive function that's going to change them, shape them evolutionarily, you need multiple generations in order to have differences in fitness and reproductive success lead to an increase in that trait. So adaptive function is always going to take place on a time scale longer than a lifetime. Similarly, if a trait is constrained evolutionarily, its history explains the trait. For morphological traits, that's obvious. Like, why do we have 2 arms and 2 legs? Well, because we evolved from tetrapods that, ever since salamanders, vertebrates have 4 limbs, right? And they have 4 limbs because the pelvic fins, the pectoral fins and the pelvic fins modified into legs. So there's a real sort of phylogenetic constraint there. But similarly, 2 species can share a behavior because it's specifically adaptive in some environmental dimension that they share, or because they both evolved from an ancestor that had that trait. That's often an important evolutionary question. So those are ultimate questions, and the proximate questions Tinbergen's framework included how do behaviors develop. So this is the longer term, but within the lifetime of an individual, and this is where you think about genes and environment interacting. And then on the shortest time frame, what are the hormonal and neural mechanisms underlying behavior? And so I will, it's definitely fair game in an exam or a quiz or something for me to give you an explanation of a behavior, and you should be able to identify it as proximate or ultimate. A harder version of that would be to ask you to, generate a proximate or an ultimate explanation for a behavior or a trait. So one sort of suite of behaviors that have been studied both on proximate and ultimate levels are cooperative breeding in birds. So I am going to try now to go into PowerPoint and see if videos work any better when they're actually in the PowerPoint. So to do that, we go back to here, we go there, we go there, we go here, good things happen, and haha. Let's see what happens. Let's see what happens when we do a slideshow. So Florida scrub jay is actually a highly endangered subspecies of scrub jays found in Florida, and young from one clutch of eggs will often remain with their parents after they've, after they've reached adulthood. And instead of trying to breed on their own, they will help their parents rear another clutch or two. And so this is called cooperative breeding, when you have multiple adults helping to rear young. And in Florida scrub jays and in some of the other examples, it's the children that are helping their parents rear another brood of children. This is a pied kingfisher. Kingfishers, I mean, this isn't the needed behavior, but it's still pretty cool. This is a pied kingfisher. It's found in southern Africa, and actually I think up into Europe. And in pied kingfishers, you have 2 kinds of helpers. You have the kinds that I talked about with the scrub jays, where you have young from the previous year staying and um, helping to rear offspring. But you also have individuals from outside the family, as those are called secondary helpers. So you have primary versus secondary helpers. Within the family, and then you have secondary. All of them are young birds. Interestingly, um, the primary helpers never inherit a breeding um, a breeding role, even if one of the breeding adults dies. The secondary helpers do, and this is probably an ultimate explanation for that would clearly be avoidance of inbreeding depression. Acorn woodpeckers are another really well-studied bird. I saw these when I was in grad school in Davis, although they were more closer to the coast in California. California oaks are a system that has actually been devastated by Phytophthora, by sudden oak death, but they have this entire ecological community that lives on the oaks, including these birds that work together, and as a group, they develop and defend these granaries, these storage holes in the trees where they store acorns to live on during the dry season. And let's see if it works. Hmm, something weird happened, and that's okay. So now let's see. Video, still no sound. Let's see. Did people hear that? I'm gonna stop sharing that. Uh, okay, no sound. Could you hear me? Okay, so you can hear me the whole time. Ugh. The unfortunate thing, David Attenborough was narrating the Acorn Woodpeckers in a British accent, so it sounded very sophisticated. Um, no worries. I will are we going to speak about insects or ants? We will. I don't think we're going to. That is a good question. I'm not sure if we're going to tonight. Um, that is a good question. I'm trying to think. There's definite, so that's such a good question. There's cultural variation in, there's no great potato beetle example in this course. Um, there's cultural variation in the dance language in bees. Um, I mean, just in the simplest, like the calibration, the slope between the duration of the waggle dance and how far a food source is varies regionally among bees. But that's I am not so sure about whether that is a culturally transmitted difference versus something like it relates directly to temperature or terrain. So that's a good question. Um, but yeah, no insect behaviors. Um, so we sadly do not know enough about the dance language in bees in this class. Um, no, the dance language is a communication. The bees do a dance where the, let's see, the angle, they'll do a waggle and then they'll make another circle and then they'll do another waggle and they'll do this over and over again. And there's lots of information in that dance. The the angle of the dance relative to vertical equals the angle of the food relative to the sun's direction in the sky, right? So the sun has a position in the sky, it's called its azimuth, and the direction of the food relative to the position of the sun is that angle. Um, the duration of the waggle, the duration of this waggle is proportional to distance. So milliseconds of waggle is proportional to um, out to like 2,000 meters is proportional to the distance in towards food, and how long they're willing to dance. Yeah, and then finally, how long they're willing to dance is proportional to how high quality the food source is, right? So there's like tons of information. Anyway, but it's not going to come up in this class, except that it just did, but I'm not going to quiz you on it. There you go. You just learned something for its own sake. I know how frustrating that can be. They dance longer when they get better food. They also dance longer. They also dance to signal where a good site might be for a new hive. And they do this great, incredibly democratic quorum sensing process where the ones that find a better hive will just dance longer. And then, therefore, they attract more other foragers to that location. And so you have this positive feedback loop that leads to the swarm settling in the potential hive location where the bees dance the longest. Anyway, back to helping cooperative breeding in birds. So, what are some ultimate why question explanations for why for bees dancing? I mean, for young birds, um, why young birds might help their parents raise or help some other birds raise their young and not um, raise young themselves, because it's a mysterious thing. Like if reproductive success, is like the currency of natural selection, you're sacrificing your own reproduction to help someone else. So one possibility is that they do it in order to practice parenting. So it might pay or pay more relatively if young birds are especially um, poor parents, like you improve with experience. So that's been studied. I'm not actually going to go into that example that much. Another ultimate explanation, another why, is a potential benefit of helping is maybe you can inherit territories. Um, Now, this is going to, again, the benefits of that are going to be greater if you're not related than if you are related, right? Because if you are related and then you get to mate with your mother or father, that might lead to offspring with a high frequency of recessive del. Hopefully hearing me now, hopefully seeing me now. And let's see if that slide is still okay. So got all the feedback. Now you can hear and see me. Do we have another slide? Okay. Okay, so we talked about ultimate explanations, maybe the benefits of that you get from helping your parents rear more siblings is greater than the costs that you get from not breeding on your own. What are some proximate explanations? Um, so the weird thing is lack of free territories can be either a proximate or an ultimate explanation, which is what's somewhat frustrating about this example. So it could be that young birds go out, try to establish a territory, and if all the potential breeding sites are full, then they go back and help their parents. It's still you still need to be it still needs to be explained why you help your parents rear young and not just like keep trying to establish a territory or just save your resources and avoid the predation risk and costs of working hard to help your parents rear young. So lack of free territories might be considered approximate or an ultimate explanation. But another proximate explanation is that has been presented, argued, is that begging um, is just a behavior that stimulates feeding behavior in any adults. And note that this is in some ways a really good explanation. Um, for example, there are whole species of birds um, called brood parasites that take advantage of the reflexive response to feed young by getting birds from other species to rear their own offspring. Um, However, the fact that begging in chicks, um, stimulates adults to feed them doesn't necessarily explain why the young birds are helping their parents rear the offspring. It is approximate explanation, but you still will need ultimate explanations to understand sort of who and why is helping. And so then the important thing is also to know that like ultimate and proximate causes are always working at the same time, right? So ultimate evolutionary adaptive functions have to operate through proximate mechanisms. The fact that there's a proximate mechanism doesn't mean that there isn't also an ultimate cause. That's kind of the main take home of this whole sort of lengthy exercise. Yes, cuckoos are the biggest group of brood parasites in Europe, and cowbirds are the biggest group of brood parasites in the North and South America. And but brood parasitism is found in a lot of Anseriformes, ducks and geese as well. There's been a lot of work on brood parasitism. I'm not totally sure if it's gonna clearly relate to cultural evolution. But it's, bread and butter behavior. Um, so one way of asking an ultimate, testing an ultimate hypothesis, like the kin selection hypothesis, is to ask whether helping behavior varies with relatedness in a way that's consistent with kin selection. So I talked before about these primary and secondary helpers in the pied kingfishers. The primaries are related to the breeders. They're the older offspring of that pair, and they never get to inherit territories. The secondary helpers are unrelated to the breeders, and they do inherit territories if one of the breeders dies. So that's kind of interesting, and that kind of relates to ultimate causation. But what's really interesting in this example is that the primary helpers work much harder than secondary helpers, right? So that's what this figure is showing. And whenever you look at any graph, what even grown-ups do, the first thing we do is we look at the x and the y-axis. Remember, the x-axis is considered the explanatory variable. It might be, or sometimes it's called the independent variable, but explanatory is more. So it's asking, okay, we're looking at 4 different kinds of birds. Male and female breeders, the adults that either fertilizing or laying the eggs, or primary, the children of the breeders, and secondary, unrelated to the breeders' helpers. Now, the strong prediction from kin selection as an ultimate explanation is that primary helpers who are actually related to the chicks should work harder than secondary helpers. Secondary helpers should work just as hard, as little as possible, for them not to be like kicked off the territory, right? And that's what they found. The y-axis is the dependent variable, the fish delivered to chicks is high in breeders. It's higher in males than in females. That's a common pattern in birds. Females are larger, which lets them lay more eggs. But the males, being smaller, are actually often better at foraging and bring more of food to the chicks. And what you can see is the primary helpers are right up there with the actual breeders in how much food that's delivered. The secondary helpers are delivering much less food, which doesn't make sense if everyone has a reflex, if the only explanation is the proximate explanation that begging stimulates feeding behavior. However, this difference does make sense under kin selection, that individuals should be much more likely to help their closest relatives. Okay. Um, a really interesting example of helping behavior and how it's been studied, and the relationship between sort of territory quality and availability and helping is in the Seychelles warbler. So Seychelles warbler used to be the rarest species of bird in the world. Sadly, it's been replaced by others, or happily, it's increased in population. And part of its increase in population was due to a recovery program that introduced Seychelles warblers to islands that used to have this species but had lost them. And so that provided an interesting kind of natural experiment, because on the parent population on Cousin, um, the birds were already, all the territories were full, and then some territories had helpers and other territories didn't. Um, when the birds were introduced to all these other islands, Aride, Cousin, Denis and Frigate or Frigate. Anyway, they'd obviously start at very low density, and then over time, densities would build up. Um, and then kin selection. Hopefully, I said that before. Oh, oh, yes. Good on you. That graph with the primary versus secondary helpers makes sense under kin selection. Um, but not under just a reflexive response to begging. So this is the interesting thing. When the Seychelles warblers were introduced to islands that didn't have any warblers, there was a lot of open space. And at that time, birds stopped helping. So as the territories became more and more saturated, um, they started to become more, as the territories became more saturated, they started to become, only when they became like about 80% saturated did you start to see helpers, right? So the one thing that's frustrating is that um, there used to be, I'm going to see if, I don't know if this hand is a good thing or not. Anyway, only when territories approach saturation did you start to get helpers. And so there seems to be kind of a sort of cost benefit thing. But one question is, are the helpers acting adaptively? In other words, um, is it just if a simple rule that if there's no territories available, you help, and if there's free territories, then you don't? Or are they behaving adaptively? And actually, it turns out that they're behaving adaptively, because what this question of whether or not to help um, varies with habitat quality. Um, and so what happened when the Seychelles warblers were introduced to a new island is, first, no one helped. And then as the available territory started to become more saturated, you started to get helpers, but only on the highest quality territories. And and then after the highest quality territories had helpers, only then did you start to get helpers on medium quality territories. You never got helpers on low quality territories. And that's because on the high quality territories, the helpers could actually help their parents rear an extra chick. So they were getting a benefit from helping. On low quality territories, even with helpers, you can't successfully raise more than one chick. Um, so territory availability has an effect but the birds are responding adaptively to not just the availability of territories, but also the quality of territories. Um, and then another way in which Seychelles warblers respond adaptively to territory quality is by changing the sex ratio of their offspring. This is something that's been shown in mammals a lot, and sometimes in birds, sometimes not in birds. There's a big advantage to being a large female in any bird, but in this species of Seychelles warblers, you can lay maybe 2 eggs instead of 1. Um, if, however, if you're a larger small male, you still have a chance to have a territory. You can still help feed the offspring. And so what happens is um, on low quality territories, Seychelles warblers are more likely to produce male offspring because they're going to, on that poor quality territory, they're going to end up being smaller. On high quality territories, and it's not in this graph, but in territories with helpers, the breeding adult is more likely to lay a female chick. And so this is another way in which they're responding adaptively to differences in territory quality. Okay, the other the other thing to see in the Seychelles warbler is similarly to the pied kingfisher example. Most of the helpers are close relatives. Closer relatives are more likely to help than less close relatives. So if both parents are still alive at the nest, they're more likely to have one of their offspring stay as a helper than if one of the parents dies or is replaced or leaves. Now those chicks from the previous year are only half sibs and they're less likely to stay and help. Okay, so this is another example of sort of an ultimate explanation. Kin selection and relatedness is affecting how likely they are to help, not just like proximity, geographic location. Okay, so I wanted to change gears and talk a little bit about um, uh, sort of what's called the modern synthesis and the role of genes versus the environment in traits, and then finally, what is the level that selection operates on. But you know what? It's been such a disaster showing videos that I'm not going to show this one. I'm going to talk just a little bit about evolution, and then I'm going to end and I'm going to post the last video, which is about 10 minutes long, by Richard Dawkins. Okay, so in intro bio and high school, we defined evolution really sort of simply as a change in gene frequency over time. And that's actually like, it's a good definition, but it's not the only definition, because you can have cultural heritable you can have traits that evolve culturally, which we'll be talking about, and there are also a number of sort of arguments that were going on early in evolutionary biology, and some of them have been sort of answered or not. So I'm going to talk about this more historically. So a more inclusive definition of evolution would simply be descent with modification. It's a little bit more subjective a definition. And it also raises many questions. One is whether change is gradual or whether there are sort of large, rapid changes or units. And so one of the quanta, the particles of change are actually mutations in new genes. So the development of genetics started to answer this, but that it's still a basic question whether evolution is gradual or sort of in fits and starts. And the answer is also um, that evolutionary rates change both within and among species. Also, when in Darwin's time, one of the things that Darwin actually didn't have much of a species concept because he was really arguing that there were no sort of single typical species, that all populations and species were continually changing and changing over time. Another sort of argument or question was the degree to which was the role of natural selection. So, um, the what Darwin was arguing is that natural selection was the primary force driving evolution. And later, people are arguing over the role of mutation, not necessarily to just provide the raw building blocks of natural selection and evolution, which is kind of how we would see it now, but actually sort of driving evolution. And then there's also this one of the um, strongest, newest points that Darwin was trying to make was that evolution is not actually directed towards a goal. Um, and there are many adaptations that so clearly match environmental challenges that it's tempting to think that, you know, the final adaptive or the present adaptive function was the goal of evolution all the time. But actually, the sort of amazing thing about evolution is that it can produce adaptations without having a goal in mind. And the way I usually define orthogenesis, I did it before as sort of guided evolution, but the way I usually define it is in terms of Star Trek evolution. So this idea that, like, I don't even know if anyone still watches Star Trek or did, but in the old show in the 60s, Spock would be sitting there on the sensor in the spaceship as it's orbiting some new planet, and he'll say something like, "It's a very primitive civilization. They haven't evolved past their early warlike ways." So um, there's this idea, there's this explicit idea that sort of human society is on a trajectory from more warlike, conflicting ways to sort of a higher civilization where wars will end and nations can either merge or at least live peaceably together. Um, and the truth is that there's often no goal in, there's no, well, there is no goal in evolution by natural selection, according to Darwin. Um, and actually, a really useful example of this right now is the arguments that people had over the evolution of virulence in disease. So it's so funny. It feels like we've been in this pandemic for, now it feels like 10 years, but it's been like, okay, close to 2 years. Um, there's a whole branch of study of the evolution of virulence. And the earliest thinking of this was, hey, it seems kind of dumb for parasites to kill their hosts. Wouldn't it make more sense if parasites evolved to become milder? Virulence, yes, exactly. So let's use another feature of Collaborate, and let's try typing. And virulence can be defined in different ways. Um, the most basic definition of virulence is harmfulness of a disease or parasite, sorry, uh, and it's often proportional to like the replication rate, right? So there's often a simple relationship between the replication rate within the host and the amount of, a toxin or a number of cells killed, negative effects. It's not necessarily, it isn't always 100% correlated, but that means that like depending on the disease, they might use virulence as a synonym for replication rate, and in another disease they might not. But so that's what virulence is, and apparently it's a hard thing to pronounce, like the rural juror. Anyway, so there's this idea that all parasites should evolve to become less harmful to their hosts over time. And it's a very tempting hypothesis, but actually, um, evolution is not like guided or goal directed. And what we've learned is there are some good cases of evolution of reduced virulence over time. One of the ones not proven but suggested is apparently um, there's a hypothesis that was developed after the last SARS epidemic, um, the one with higher mortality rates, mostly in Asia, not this one, um, that there was a coronavirus outbreak in the end of the 19th century, like 1898, that was called Russian flu and had very high mortality. And there's a research group that was studying their sequencing them and arguing that their closest relative is an almost harmless cold today. But there are also, and then the other classic example is myxoma virus in rabbits. But there's a few things about that example, and I might develop this when we talk about levels of selection later in the course. One is there are examples of evolution of increased virulence as well as reduced virulence. And the best studied example is the evolution of virulence in cholera, which is a disease that can be spread many different ways. It can be spread through the water supply, but it can also be spread through direct contact and also by like handling of food and dishes and plates. And uh, it's killing me. I've lost the power of speech because I'm forgetting the name of the researcher. Used to be at Amherst, now is it like like Emory, who is studying this. Paul Ewald, there you go, who showed that in South America there was a correlation, even after factoring out wealth and access to hospitals and other measures of modern medicine, there was a strong correlation between access to clean water and the virulence of cholera. Because if people had to use water from the same river where sewage was going into, then even when people were being killed by cholera, their bedclothes being washed in the river would spread the parasite. And so basically it stopped being costly for the parasite to kill its host. Whereas in places where people were given access to clean water or treated water, so that that mode of transmission via the water supply was cut off, now cholera could only spread through direct contact or handling of plates and dishes. And so now the hosts only transmitted cholera when they were healthy enough to come in direct contact with other people. And so countries that had clean water supply, separate from overall economic development and access to modern medicine, had less virulent cholera, but countries with poorer access to clean water had more virulent cholera. So you could see that you could direct the evolution, you could manage it to be either more virulent or less virulent, depending on, in this case, access to clean water. So this is where this idea of orthogenesis can sometimes lead us astray. So there are some people in the beginning of the COVID epidemic who were saying, this is nothing to worry about because, as we all know, there's an evolutionary law that diseases evolve to become less virulent. No, there isn't. It's a great question, but there's no guarantee that a specific disease is going to evolve to lower virulence. Interestingly, you can think about how different practices might affect virulence evolution. Anyway, I'll develop that theme more later. Okay, so this is actually the history lesson, not supposed to be jumping into every part of the course. So here we have the entangled bank, which is the part of Darwin that does get quoted that often. So he's talking about natural selection. These laws, which it's true. This is what I was trying to quote. And there you go. It's better to actually have a quote. You know what's even better? To include quotation marks. But this is a quote. These laws, taken in the largest sense, being growth with reproduction, inheritance, which is almost implied by reproduction, variability from the indirect and direct action of the external conditions of life, and from use and disuse. So this is really fascinating about Darwin. A rate of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, which we usually learn as struggle for existence, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailed divergence of character in the extinction of less improved forms. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, naming the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life. What's really interesting about this paragraph, aside from that it's kind of elegant and it gets quoted a lot, is that note that Darwin really doesn't know how inheritance works. And also, so there's nothing about genes here because genes were not discovered or invented or even theoretically posited yet. There's stuff about use and disuse. So you remember from intro bio where use and disuse was? That was Lamarck, right? The idea that giraffes are stretching to try to reach high leaves, and that leads to offspring with slightly longer necks. This is considered Lamarckianism. But actually, Darwin and Lamarck, neither of them had a good sense of how inheritance worked. Both of them were just sort of fishing around, right? And so Darwin and Lamarck were different, but they were different in that Lamarck believed in orthogenesis, thought that there was like an end and a direction to evolution. Darwin thought that adaptations happened due to sort of a random walk through what was leading to higher reproductive success and those traits becoming more common. So the idea of use and disuse as an inheritance mechanism was shared with Lamarck and Darwin, this idea of inheritance of acquired characters. Interestingly, this idea, so what was different between Darwin and Lamarck was whether or not evolution was guided, this idea of orthogenesis. But this idea of use and disuse continued into the 20th century. And you can tell why use and disuse would be really interesting not just to biologists, but the idea that offspring can inherit traits based on the practices of their parents is very tempting to anyone who's trying to like build society and improve societies, right? So, and there was a famous case of scientific fraud described by Paul Kammerer who is trying to argue that frogs inherited traits based on the environmentally induced, temperature-induced morphological changes in the parents. So what did Darwin think about inheritance? He didn't understand about genetics. He had this idea that that there was this process called pangenesis, and that there were these particles called gemmules that were floating around in the body, and the gemmules would gradually accumulate in the gonads and would be taken up by the reproductive cells, eggs and sperm, and then they'd be passed on to their offspring. And so these gemmules that were the particles of inheritance could be built up and also affected by environment. In this little cartoon, there's a little environmental factor, this little bomb that leads to a change in head shape, and that environmental factor accumulates in the gemmules and ends up accumulates in the gemmules or accumulates in the reproductive cells and then leads to offspring that have a modified form of that environmental factor. The other problem with Darwin is that he thought that you had sort of blended inheritance, which poses a huge problem for natural selection. So for Darwin, not having a theory of inheritance is a real problem. One, if you think that inheritance is just a blended average of both parents, over time, all that blending will lead to no more variation. And if there isn't variation, there's no ingredients for natural selection to act on. It also, if you think that all traits are inherited by blending of many, many particles, you actually think that all variation is continuous, and you don't think there are any sort of discrete differences among individuals. And Darwin definitely downplayed discrete or discontinuous variation, and even downplayed the idea of whether or not there were species, which is kind of interesting. I mean, Darwin was working so hard just to show that species could change, which is true, they can, that he sort of pushed the boundaries of both inheritance, which wasn't understood, and species definition, just to be able to make that point. Other evolutionary biologists came up with different contributions to understanding of inheritance. August Weismann was the researcher who argued, among other things, that there was a discrete separation of the germline, the cells that would become egg and sperm, and the soma, the body tissue. We're going to be coming back to why that is incredibly important for basically our bodies to function as high-performing groups, of cells, which is actually what we are. And then the discovery, sort of first the hypothesis, and then support, and then later, which later led after Mendel to discovery of particulate inheritance of discrete genes. So Mendel sort of coined the term of genes that were inherited from each parent. And this idea that you'd have this particulate inheritance that would allow for variation that isn't always expressed, dominant and recessive inheritance, and then the idea that variation, the offspring aren't always a blended average of the parents, that you have these discrete genes that are passed on, and so variation isn't lost even in traits that are inherited with dominant and recessive inheritance, not additive inheritance. Okay, so August Weismann, he's doing a bunch of things. One is he's arguing it for natural selection as a driving force of evolution rather than sort of orthogenesis or some other process, um, and also that the germline and somatic tissues must be separated early on in order for traits to be sort of um, not um, vulnerable to environmental insult. So the idea that take home from separating the germline and somatic tissue is that some environmental factor can have a big effect on how the soma, the body, develops, um, but that's not going to be passed on. Only what was in the germline from the beginning. We're actually learning ways in which that is um, not true, um, with methylation patterns that can be inherited. But this is, again, this is sort of the history part. So Weissman also didn't understand heritability, but this idea of a separation of the germline and the soma was very influential. Um, and the idea that the hereditary units have to be halved before reproduction was really an important one, right? Because otherwise we'd be doubling our information, our we'd be doubling the heritable part every generation. So the idea that it had to be halved, the fact that he didn't understand what genes were or hadn't worked it out, that's okay. Um, so Darwin's ideas about inheritance were not, they weren't coherent, and so they also weren't supported experimentally. So um, actually, a nephew of Darwin, Galton, who we'll be talking about a lot in the third lecture, was doing a bunch of experiments to study pangenesis. So basically, what he would do is take blood transfusions between rabbits that had different fur color and see if it affected the fur color of the offspring, and that had no effect, right? So this was a really nice example of, you have a hypothesis, you make a prediction. Oh, if there are these gammules flowing around our blood and accumulating in the germline, then if we change the blood, we should be able to affect what the offspring look like. Did the experiments, saw no effect. Um, However, also Galton was disturbed sort of mathematically with the idea that inheritance is blended and that all change sort of happens slowly and gradually, because he was frightened that what we were going to do is lose our geniuses. And so Galton was arguing for large mutations having of large effect, driving most adaptive evolution. And also, he was not that excited about natural selection. He had more sort of a, I don't know, orthogenic, goal-directed evolution in mind. Um, Mendel, which we remember from intro bio, so I'm just going to zip through this, was a monk in Austria, now part of the Czech Republic, and he published results of a series of crosses. He only picked the traits that actually fit the hypothesis. There are other traits that are inherited in non-Mendelian fashion, but that's okay, because what he described was a really useful building block. So the traits were color, shape, round versus smooth, size of the plant, color of the flower in peas. And what he found, first of all, when you cross smooth and wrinkled peas, all the offspring are smooth. So that's interesting. There's no blending. You don't get somewhat smooth peas. And then, fascinatingly, if you take those hybrid offspring and cross them to each other, you reconstitute the wrinkled phenotype. Very exciting. It also shows that variation isn't lost. It's not blended and sort of diluted out. So this this is, a big, a, a, a major advance. Um, he looked at a series of traits, um, and what that got us to is what's called the modern synthesis in the early 20th century, which was the discovery and then the development of Mendelian genetic theory with evolution by natural selection. So what the modern synthesis showed was that yes, you can have natural selection on traits, and it's an interesting question. In some cases, you might lose genetic variation over time. You might be able to select a trait, but then reach the limits until there are new mutations for a trait. But the you're not going to, in general, but there were lots of studies on rates of mutation and how often mutations take place, and this was done both looking at natural mutations and by using things like chemicals and radiation to stimulate mutations in Drosophila and then other species. And a lot of the nuts and bolts of sort of evolutionary theory that in fact the mutation rates that we observe in nature are sufficient to provide enough variation for realistic levels of strength of natural selection to cause the changes that we've seen over time. Okay, so that's the modern synthesis. It's the combination of population genetics and natural selection. And it leads to the Dobzhansky definition of evolution as a change in the genetic composition of populations. Since the 1930s, we've actually learned what the chemistry and now what the sequence of first proteins and then DNA are. And so we've learned a lot of things. We learned what DNA is and RNA. We've learned, however, also that DNA exists not just in the nucleus, that there's a lot more variation than population geneticists expected after sequencing started first with electrophoresis in the 60s and now with with more modern sequencing. And this was sort of exciting and weird. And that also led to the understanding that a lot of DNA is not expressed. So it's not being selected on strongly all the time. And that a lot of evolutionary change in genes is not due to natural selection. It's due to genetic drift and the balance between drift and mutation. That allows us to do things like use molecular clocks to date, the times of outbreaks or when species diverged or populations diverged from each other. But more recently, what we've learned is that lots of important variation in organisms is not due to differences in genes, but it's due to differences in how genes are expressed, which sometimes is due to other genes, sometimes it's due to environment, sometimes it's due to inheritance mechanisms other than changes in DNA. And I think that I think I'm gonna have to stop myself here, because it's gonna take more than 10 minutes to complete the last unit, which is the levels of selection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here. I'm going to create a Dropbox and share it with you. I'm going to post 2 videos that I want you to watch before next week, and then I'll start off next week with a little bit of a discussion about altruism, and the levels of selection. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm going to stop recording, but I'm going to hang out here for a few more minutes, especially if there are any questions.